Today's episode is sponsored by Rev, the productivity powerhouse for content creators, journalists, market researchers, and more. Capture audio from anywhere, get AI-powered summaries and quotes, and leave security worries behind with Rev. Whether you're on the go or in the office, Rev's got you covered. Discover more at rev.com. Hi, I'm Kendall Kelton, and I'm your host today on The Rough Draft. Featuring honest conversations with folks from across the creative industry, The Rough Draft explores the creative process, tools, and resources used by some of the best in the business. From journalists to content creators and business leaders, we shed light on what it looks like to break into the industry, make mistakes, collaborate with others, and the essential tools that help us all along the way. This week, I'm super excited to be talking with Jamilah King. Jamilah is an editorial director at Mother Jones and oversees a team of investigative reporters covering race, politics, criminal justice, and more. She previously worked as a managing editor at Buzzfeed, and as a reporter, she's profiled Kamala Harris, Stacey Abrams, and Lucy McBath. Her work has also appeared on HBO, Showtime, and CNN. On today's episode, Jamilah is going to talk about her extensive coverage of Kamala Harris over the last 15 years and reporting during a high-stakes election. Jamilah, you and Kamala Harris are both from the Bay Area.
Yes, we are.
And how do you think growing up in that particular cultural and political environment has shaped your understanding of her political rise? I mean, you have been reporting on her for years now.
I think growing up in the Bay Area has allowed me to understand not just Kamala Harris and how she approached politics, but sort of how diverse a particular party or segment of politics can be, right? So I think on the national level, especially in national elections, we're used to thinking about Democrats and Republicans, right? In the Bay Area, which is a fairly progressive place, but there is a lot of gradation in there, and there's a lot of conservative values, conservative pockets, right? So if anything, it's allowed me to I think, approach looking at her in a pretty nuanced way, because I think the Bay Area is a really beautiful, full, diverse, but very nuanced place. And, she grew up in Oakland. I grew up in San Francisco. We're about 2 decades apart in age, but I think still the residue of so many of the political movements that the Bay Area is known for was very much present in my childhood as it was with hers. So I'm talking about the Black Panther Party. I'm talking about, gay liberation struggles. I'm talking about sort of, 1960s, 1970s anti-war protests and movements. And so all of that stuff was really palpable. And for me, for instance, some of the most tangible ways that showed up for me was not, at my dining room table. It was, I grew up in San Francisco, really close to the Haight-Ashbury. And so there were a lot of sort of aging hippies around, folks who come to San Francisco to protest the war and then gotten involved and then gotten pretty deep into drugs and were by my childhood, the folks who were kind of the eccentric people in the neighborhood sleeping on the streets and whatever, right? And so I say that because it's, there's an idealism that is also kind of tragic, right? You see kind of all shades of it. And I think that has shaped a lot of my perspective of covering her rise, and I think my approach to politics in general.
What were some of the earlier stories or maybe even just characteristics you noticed about her that may have been overlooked by broader media until maybe her presidential bid?
Let's see. Some of the older stories, I think, had to do with how Kamala Harris was able to build or not build coalitions wherever she was. I think she was always this sort of newcomer who was a little bit different. And the sort of ruptures that caused, I think, are probably more telling of her than the history that it's made, right? So I think you'll notice now in this year she's not talking a lot externally about the historic nature of her running again for president, or what it would mean for her as a woman, as a Black woman, as a biracial person to be the a president. And I think that's part of it. But like, I think in order to even get through the political gatekeepers of San Francisco, she had to be really, really ruthless. That's the sort of through line that I've seen with her, is just this very calculated approach to everything. And sometimes that's been, not in her favor. It's made her seem excessively cautious. But also, it kind of shows that she's someone who is not just running on like good vibes and luck, right? Like she's had some skin in the game, and she's been beaten up quite a bit. So that's something I've noticed for sure.
Yeah, and I think especially when she was kind of thrust into the national spotlight, when she was in the Senate and all of these hearings that she was participating in, people started to really see kind of like that more ruthless, calculated kind of side of her. And we're like, whoa, who is this? Like, who is this person? I guess as she's like kind of moved into that kind of larger spotlight, had your perspective of her shift like at all? Or you're like, no, this is the person that I watched back in California?
I think she's remarkably similar. Like, she's not a different person by any means. I think if anything, she's smarter, older, wiser, like hopefully we all are in the 20 years that we're doing something. But I do think that what has been surprising to me is kind of watching how she deals with failure. I mean, in 2021, she was having a really rough go of it. It was kind of like,
that was the Lester Holt interview, was that year? Yeah.
That was a Lester Holt interview that went really poorly. And, there were a lot of stories about how Biden should replace her on the ticket, essentially, because of all these things. And those stories were pretty persistent all up until, basically July of 2024. I think that how someone deals with failure is very instructive. And I think in her case, you've seen like a lot of I would assume introspection and sort of just rejiggering of all the things. And yeah, I just, it's been really interesting to see her as sort of like the center of a universe of pretty powerful Black elected officials, Black women elected officials that she's created over the years, that include like Latifah Simon and London Breed, and mostly Californian politicians who, are not necessarily all super loved by progressives. In fact, some of them have very contentious relationships with progressives. And so I personally like to see that tension. I like it when it's made clear that not all Black people and not all Black women think the same. Like, that's important to note.
We're all just human. We all have different thoughts and opinions. Yeah.
We're all just human, right?
Yeah.
We're all figuring it out. And really, the question is like, can she manage an office, right? The most powerful office in the world, but can she manage an office? And I think that is the question that we're grappling with right now.
Yeah. And so like the election is 24 days away from when we're filming this. And what do you think in these last couple of weeks, like the challenges and opportunities for her campaign?
At this rate, people are kind of set in their ways and set in what they think. So the question is will excitement about her candidacy reach people who were on the fence and maybe weren't going to vote, but now they're thinking about voting, right? And I that stand-up, I think, doesn't exist or hasn't really existed in the Democratic Party since like Obama. But I think it's also important to remember that, Obama wasn't the most beloved figure for progressives, in 2007, 2008. So
watching like how election coverage has changed since Obama and then with Trump and then now with Harris, how do you think about like election specific coverage and approaching it? Because it feels like the stakes are much higher.
Yeah. It does feel like the stakes are higher. I think it's helpful to talk to politicians, but I think it's a great opportunity to talk to communities about what they want and what they're seeing. And I think giving more airtime to folks in communities is important. I think elections are an opportunity to, it's the performance evaluation of our leadership every 4 years, right? And we get to set the goals. We get to say, this is what we want. These are the merits that we're going to judge you on over the next 4 years. And so my hope is that more people can be part of that conversation or feel like they're part of that conversation, even if they're not excited about the candidate or candidates, right? I totally understand that. My hope is that they turn out to vote and are able to just at least be part of the conversation, because we're not looking to have a cheerleader in the White House. We're looking to have somebody that we want to hold accountable.
Yeah.
Like, who would you rather fight with, right?
Yeah.
Like, who would you rather kind of be battling against? And that's how I see it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that's it for today's episode of The Rough Draft. Be sure to rate and subscribe in order to stay up to date with the latest episodes, and visit rev.com/podcasts for even more content. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of The Rough Draft.